Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning. There are many, many interesting talks happening at this very moment, and I think if I wasn't talking, I'd be somewhere else. As a member of the programming committee, we are supposed to introduce ourselves. We're also supposed to time ourselves. So I found these numbers here, and I think if I put them together properly, it will tell me exactly how many minutes I have to give my talk. Does that look right? So not only would I like to welcome you, but I would also like to introduce somebody I've known for many years, somebody I've known intimately for many years, really since the moment he was born. He's a scholar of the classical Daoist tradition and a person who has worked hard to establish a contemplative studies concentration at Brown University. He will have a little bit to say about that and about his work in classical Daoism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Hal Roth. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm afraid I can't give you any Daoist puns because for some reason Daoist technical terminology doesn't work quite as well with punning. But if one comes up during the talk, I'll definitely mention it. So I've changed the title of my talk just a little bit. I mean, 6 months ago I was asked to give a title for my talk and a summary of it, and that is so early compared to when I actually finished it, which was the day before yesterday. So I've changed the title a little bit, but it's still on Daoism, and it still relates to something very important, I think, for both sciences and humanities, the attunement of subjectivity. So I'd like to begin actually by talking to you a little bit about what we've done at Brown in contemplative studies, and hopefully that will be relevant because the framework that we've developed there for what we call integrative contemplative pedagogy actually has some elements that will be useful in unraveling some of the mysteries of classical Daoist contemplative practice. Starting now about 12 years ago, a dedicated group of faculty, encouraged by a wonderful group of students, has been working on what we came to call the Contemplative Studies Initiative. We have developed the foundations for the education that, if you can see it here, that William James more than a century ago, in a very visionary way, said was the education par excellence. An education that brings back a wandering attention again and again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. So that's really in many ways the basis of what we've attempted to do in contemplative studies at Brown. Within the past few months, the university has seen fit to accept us as a formal undergraduate concentration, a formal undergraduate major. I won't go into this slide in detail, but just to tell you that in this undergraduate concentration, you can either you do a series of core courses in the humanities and in the sciences, and also take a kind of introduction to the field, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then you focus on either a sciences track, which is focused on humanities, is focused on cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience, or a humanities track, which is focused on philosophy of mind or contemplative religious traditions. But one of the most important elements in our concentration is we do not limit ourselves to third-person study of the relevant humanities and sciences. We also engage students in the critical first-person apprehension of contemplative practices and contemplative experiences through what we have developed called meditation lab courses. It's a little hard to see because of the lighting. It's actually really hard to see because of the lighting, but anyway, we're in a dance studio here. One of the wonderful opportunities we have, because dancers tend to stay up late, is that they don't get up early. So we have the opportunity to use the dance studio for meditation space in the mornings. So our courses that have meditation labs, we meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 9 to 9:50. We also have a once a week or twice a week meeting, a seminar class meeting. And in the meditation labs, we try out practices that are directly related to the readings that we're doing in the rest of the course. So we try out these practices so that students understand what the cognitive and conceptual context is of the contemplative practices, but they have no need to commit to the veracity of these practices. They don't have to believe in them. They just need to know what the cognitive texts are, and then they test those in their own experience within the meditation labs. So we've developed these 4 interactive perspectives that we call integrative contemplative pedagogy. The third-person perspective investigates contemplative topics and texts from the distanced approach of the so-called neutral or objective observer. We find this in the sciences, social sciences, humanities, commonly throughout the university. Second-person approaches engage in intersubjective communication and deep listening. First-person approaches are really grounded in subjective experience, and no-person approaches, which we're kind of developing slowly but surely and working them out conceptually, involve immediate experience, which is non-intentional and non-self-referential. And I want to focus in on first-person and no-person experiences just for a minute. So what we do is what we call critical first-person perspectives. They're grounded in the experiencing subject, and in our courses they involve doing contemplative practices, as I said, within the context of understanding, but not being expected to believe in the conceptual framework in which the practices are embedded. And of course, that's a very important move. You can't expect students to embrace the truth of any particular conceptual or religious system within a secular university, and that's not what we're asking them to do. Although a lot of people outside of contemplative studies think that's what we're doing, but it's one of the things you have to make absolutely clear in setting up a contemplative studies program. No-person perspectives represent immediate experience in the present moment, not in past or future. The no-person experience is non-objectified by the first-person experiencing subject. It is cognizant without judging. It can involve implicit subject-object distinctions, but not self and other distinctions. And it is first and foremost embodied. So in the very instant that you first hear that sound, there's a pure cognition of that sound that counts as a no-person experience. And then the reflecting action of consciousness comes in, starts to make sense, and then you start to raise other, in subsequent seconds, happens very fast. Subsequent conceptions develop about, why did he ring the bell, or that's the sound of a bell, or what kind of bell is that, or where can I buy a bell like that? It sounds pretty good. All that is subsequent to the no-person experience that begins that whole train. Third-person perspectives are essential to rational scholarship in the sciences and the humanities, but they cannot be relied upon alone to render the best possible research outcomes. This is because these analytical dualistic perspectives often labor under the pretense, or perhaps the delusion, that they are purely objective, unbiased, and rational. Despite the nobility of these goals, scholarly objectivity is a slippery phantom, often falling victim to precisely the kinds of subjective biases it was intended to prevent. In the humanities, this can lead to passing off hidden subjective agendas as scholarly truths. In the sciences, researcher bias can skew the design and results of major and well-funded research projects. In the past 5 years, there are almost 40 cases of misconduct in government-funded research projects listed on the website of the Office of Research Integrity of HHS. So why has this happened? Until the past, let's say, decade and a half, most research in the humanities and sciences was locked into paradigms that involved exclusively third-person approaches, studying topics at a distance, as if it was possible to have a totally neutral God's eye view, an objective view from nowhere. In the humanities, this has led to various important intellectual movements: postmodernism, socio-historical reductionism, cultural relativism. And in the sciences, this has led to some extreme forms of biological reductionism and what Alan Wallace calls scientific materialism. And this is true even when applied to the investigation of human consciousness, which is something that concerns us all very much here in this symposium. Subjectivity had been totally written out of the sciences and extremely restricted in the humanities. But ironically, the very human subjectivities that created these old paradigms were somehow immune from investigation by anything but so-called objective third-person paradigms. In the last decade, however, of the 20th century, a number of philosophers and scientists began to seriously question this deliberate omission of human subjectivity as a tool for investigating itself. And in works such as The Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche, and in Alan Wallace's Taboo of Subjectivity, we start to see the formation of a different way, a different approach, the reintroduction of the subjective perspective into scholarly research, scientific research, and into humanistic teaching. So together, and these are, I think, foundational works for the field of contemplative studies. So in our Intro to Contemplative Studies course, these are the two first philosophical framing books for the field, that help define the field that we read. Together, these books argue that not only is it possible to use systematically trained human subjectivity to clearly and impartially examine itself, but it is imperative in cognitive science and psychology to do this. I would also argue that it is crucial in the humanities as well. When this is done, we not only develop a critical self-awareness of the biases we're bringing to the table, develop the ability to use rationality for its own sake and not in the service of an unexamined subjective bias. We also develop some methods for becoming aware of the intuitive and creative processes that underlie all great scientific and humanistic discoveries. Interestingly enough, the classical Daoist tradition of the 4th through 2nd centuries BCE was fully aware of the kinds of problems caused by unexamined subjective biases. At that time, it happened to be on the part of the rulers of the so-called warring states. They developed practices that could counter the deleterious effects of subjective bias. I would like to adopt my former student and colleague, Professor Zheng H. Li's concept of ethical attunement, and call this process in classical Daoism the process of attuning subjectivity. It is, in essence, using the framework that we developed for integrative contemplative pedagogy. It is bringing no-person perspectives into third, second, and first-person experiences. So Daoists of this period developed contemplative meditation techniques that awakened human subjectivity to its inherent biases, freed adepts from attachment to the notion of a fixed self, and cultivated a flowing cognition that enabled responses that were perfectly attuned to the specific situation in which they found themselves and which were also spontaneously creative. This is precisely what we need today in scientific and humanistic research. Meditation in classical China is most often and most readily found in an early tradition of practice, thought, and literature that was later associated with the label Daoism. Whether or not this label was present before the 2nd century BCE, the evidence for this distinct tradition of practice and thought to which it came to refer later is contained in a body of extant texts that include this very important work, Neiya, Inward Training, from the Zhuangzi collection, and works that are much better known probably to people in this audience and to people everywhere, the Lao Tzu and the Zhuangzi. What we find in these texts is a consistent body of meditational theory and practice that I have called inner cultivation. This generally involves apophatic, that is, via negativa, contemplative techniques in which the normal contents of consciousness are emptied out or forgotten through extensive meditation, usually a sitting practice that eventually leads, according to these early textual sources, to the direct experience of the Tao, or the Way. The Tao is a unified power or force that infuses the entire cosmos, serves as its essential ground and the guiding principle within each phenomenon that enables it to spontaneously move along the natural course of its development. It both transcends any and all phenomena, yet is immanent within them. It is paradoxically impossible to see, hear, touch, feel, or conceive of as an object. It plays a role similar to that of Yahweh, God, or Allah in Abrahamic traditions. When people and things manifest this Tao, they have what the tradition calls potency, or Da. So, the Tao can be accessed or experienced through certain distinctive contemplative practices. And they're really first detailed in this wonderful, heretofore overlooked work from the Zhuangzi collection, a work of 76 different texts, most of which are devoted to political and economic thought, but which contain 4 gems of classical Daoist inner cultivation practice, including this text, Inward Training. I discussed this in my second book, Original Tao. This is a characteristic way in which this text, Neye, Inward Training, talks about the Tao and how to attain it. The way has no fixed position. It abides within the excellent mind. When the mind is tranquil and the vital breath is regular, the way can thereby be halted. That way is not distant from us. When people attain it, they are sustained. That way is not separated from us. When people accord with it, they are harmonious. Therefore, concentrated, as if you could be roped together with it. Indiscernible, as if beyond all locations. The true state of that way, how could it be conceived of and pronounced upon? Cultivate your mind. Make your thoughts tranquil, and the way can thereby be grasped. So, in Inward Training, classical Daoist contemplative practice involved attaining mental tranquility through focused attention on the breathing. In this next passage, there is a more explicit discussion of how this focused attention on the breathing could be conducted. And actually, I'd like to run a little experiment with you, if you're willing. It's completely up to you, but this is what we do in our contemplative studies classes. I've reconstructed a possible meditation technique based on this passage. So if you'd like, please sit. We're just going to do this for a couple of minutes. Sit upright in your chairs, feet on the floor. Hands on your knees or in this circular hand position in your lap. Eyes closed. Begin by taking 3 deep and relaxing breaths into your whole body-mind space. For all to practice this way, you must coil, you must contract. You must uncoil, you must expand. So this coiling and uncoiling refers to the expansion and contraction of the abdominal breathing muscles. So imagine that you have a coiled spring connected from the diaphragm to the cinnabar field, 3 finger widths below your navel and halfway between your navel and your back, your spine. As you breathe in, that expands, and as you breathe out, that coiled spring contracts. For all to practice this way, you must coil, you must contract. You must uncoil, you must expand. You must be firm. You must be regular in this practice. Hold fast to this excellent practice. Do not let go of it. Chase away the excessive in perception, abandon the trivial in thoughts, and eventually you will reach the ultimate limit of this practice, and when you do, you will return to the way and its inner power. So let's spend a few minutes just coiling and uncoiling. No need to think about the future or about the past. No problems to solve. Follow your breathing. Fall into this coiling and uncoiling practice. Slowly open your eyes. Yeah, I have a problem when I practice this in the classroom is that I don't want to stop. There was a debate in Sung Dynasty China between people who practice koan Zen and people who practice silent illumination Zen. And the people who practiced koan Zen called the others worms in the mud. So it feels, when you're going into kind of no person samadhi, like it's so comfortable and you just don't want to come out. But anyway, we have to come out. So this is one of the practices reconstructed from inward training. Another important source that you all know, the Lao Tzu, supposedly written by this figure from the 6th century BCE who taught the rites to Confucius, but we now know the text is much later, composite work probably coming together sometime in the first 3 decades of the 3rd century BCE. You know the famous passage, this is not yet the famous passage, but this is also about doing a similar kind of apophatic via negativa practice. Block the openings, shut the doors, blunt the sharpness of intellectual distinctions, untangle the knots of the emotions, soften the glare of forced attention, and let your wheels move only along old ruts, that is, fall into your breathing. This is known as the profound merging. The famous first chapter talks about the way that can be objectified isn't the eternal way, but then really focuses in on what turns out to be practice advice. Hence, always negate desires to contemplate its secrets, but always affirm desires in order to observe its manifestations of the Tao. So these passages on the way indicate some aspects of the distinctive meditation practice of classical Daoism that aims at attaining the experience of union or merging with the way. In Neya and inward training, making the mind tranquil through attentive focus to breathing is what's recommended. In the Lao Tzu, it involves first eliminating desires, perceptions, and thoughts, and then allowing them to arise in a new way. What this leads to is directly experiencing the way through meditation practice as the foundation of the classical Daoist contemplative practice, the contemplative tradition. And in general, chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching captures this. In the pursuit of learning, we increase every day, but in the pursuit of the way, we decrease every day. We decrease and further decrease until we reach the point of taking no action. No action is taken, yet nothing is left undone. So what we have in these sources is emptying out, a practice of emptying out the normal contents of consciousness through sitting still, circulating the breath, concentrating awareness, restricting perceptions, feelings, thoughts, desires, metaphorically wiping clean the mirror of consciousness, leading eventually to merging with the way, and then returning to the world. This return to the world is very important, and it results in, among many other things, effortless action, that is action not from the standpoint of a fixed self or fixed ego that accomplishes whatever it sets out to do. So these apophatic practices of emptying consciousness through a variety of breathing practices is foundational, leading to the direct experience of the way when all distinctions, including self and other, subject and object, melt away. But this is not the goal of classical Daoist contemplative practice. It is the resulting transformation of consciousness on returning to the dualistic world that is paramount. And it's best developed in the third of these texts from the classical tradition, the Zhuangzi. The Zhuangzi also shares the apophatic interests and practices with the other earlier sources of the tradition, metaphorically talking about letting organs and members drop away, that is, losing visceral awareness of the emotions and desires, dismissing eyesight and hearing, cutting off sense perception, parting from the body and expelling knowledge, losing bodily awareness, and then merging with the great pervader, the concept of merging with the Tao, very important apophatic practice. Another famous passage is the fasting of the mind passage. Unify your attention. Rather than listening with your ears, listen with your mind. Rather than listening with your mind, listen with your breathing. Listening stops at the ears. The mind stops at what it can objectify. As for your breathing, it becomes empty and waits to respond to things. The way gathers in emptiness. Emptiness is attained through the fasting of the mind. And a little bit later in the passage, we have the statement, it is rather easy to stop walking, but it is much more difficult to walk without touching the ground. This is Zhuangzi's metaphor for living in the world without the ground of a fixed and attached self-identity. This is living with a subjectivity attuned to the impulses of the way as one engages in daily living. And this fundamentally alters cognition and attunes subjectivity to the deeper processes that underlie it, leading to, among other things, a serious questioning of the subjective bias in the categories of knowledge that human beings create, as is found in chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi says, for there to be true and false before they are formed in the mind would be just as ridiculous as the phrase, I go to you at today, but I arrived there yesterday. This would be crediting with existence what has no existence, and if you do that, even the divine deity, you, could not understand you. How could you possibly expect to be understood by me? Categories of knowledge, says Zhuangzi, are true relative to the perspectives that create them. He goes on, what is it is also other. What is other is also it. Over there, someone says, this is true, that's not, from one point of view. And over here we say, that's true, this is not from another point of view. Are there really it and other, or really no it and no other? Where neither it nor other finds its opposite is called the axis of the way. Once the axis is found at the center of the circle, there is no limit to responding with either. On the one hand, no limit to what is it, and on the other, no limit to what is not. Therefore, I say the best means is illumination, Ming. So, for Zhuangzi, by the direct experience of the embodiment of the way, it is possible to break free of relativistic truths, to experience a mode of cognition that can, without hesitation or limit, respond to whatever realities are present in any situation. Zhuangzi conceives of this experience as an illumined mode of cognition based in a consciousness centered in the way. Such a consciousness is utterly without bias and able to fluidly and spontaneously respond to all the viewpoints and limited visions of reality that it encounters. This illumined mode of cognition is so freed from bias that it has no subjective preferences. Zhuangzi goes on, no thing is not other, no thing is not it. If you treat yourself as other, they do not appear. This is why sages open things to the lucid light of nature. Theirs too is a flowing cognition. So to rephrase, true and false, it and other are third-person perspectives based in individual biases. They are not in any way objective. However, there is a perspective from which all these other perspectives are seen as equally valid or invalid. This is the perspective that comes about from the direct experience of the way. It is attained through apophatic practices that enable you to have no more attachment to your own personal preferences and biased point of view than to anyone else's. This is signified by the notion of treating yourself as other. So keeping an unbiased, way-centered focus amidst a constantly changing world for Zhuangzi is the perspective that sees all things as equal. Therefore, when fixed cognition differentiates a stalk from a pillar, a leper from the beauty Shishir, the way pervades and unifies them. Only those who see right through things realize how to pervade and unify. They do not use fixed cognition, but lodge their attention in the ordinary flow of experience. To lodge in the ordinary flow of experience is to manifest it. When you manifest it, you can pervade things, and the one who pervades things attains it. And once you attain it, you are just about there. And then, flowing cognition comes to an end, and when it does, that of which we do not know, or you do not know what is so of it, you call the way. So epistemologically, the way is what we cannot know as an object via third-person experience in which we're separate from it. That is, we can't know it as so. We can only know it through what we've been calling no-person experience, in which the objectifying self collapses. This experience is transient, and it is increasingly frequent as you continue within the Daoist apophatic path. This leads to an attunement of subjectivity so that it can pervade and unify different perspectives, enabling a spontaneous cognition that is completely unbiased and purely spontaneous. We become directly connected to the situation in which we are embedded via the way, which pervades all underlying patterns present in the situation. And to do this is later in the text called Ti Dao, embodying the Dao, embodying the way. This type of flowing cognition is not only subjectively unbiased, it is also the source of intuition and creativity, as many passages in chapters 3 and 19 of the Zhuangzi detail. Kukding carving an ox, the cicada catcher reeling in insects, the skilled swimmer over the Spine Bridge Falls, and the following passage about a bell stand carver are all examples. Woodcarver Ching chipped wood to make a bell stand, and when it was finished, viewers were amazed. The Marquis of Lu asked him about his secret. Your servant is a mere artisan. What secret could he have? However, there is one point. When I'm going to make a bell stand, I take care never to waste my energies, and I make sure to fast in order to still my mind. This is a reference to the fasting of the mind passage that I quoted earlier. After 3 days of this, I do not care to keep in mind congratulations and reward. After 5 days, I do not care to keep in mind your blame or praise, my skill or clumsiness. After fasting 7 days, I am so intent that I forget I have a body and 4 limbs. During this time, my Lord's court does not exist for me. The only thing I do is go into the forest and observe the nature of the wood as nature makes it grow. And only then do I have a complete vision of the bell stand and put my hand to it. Otherwise, I give the whole thing up. So after 3 days, after 5 days, complete lack of self-consciousness, the objectifying self has fallen away. He's completely manifesting, completely absorbed in no-person experience. So he goes into the forest, can pick out the tree, and actually can start to see the bell stand in the wood, and spontaneously goes about carving it out and creating this rare final product. So, embodying the way in Zhuangzi implies non-self-referential experience in the present moment, free from self-objectification. It is immediate, unbiased, spontaneous, intuitive. So, why does this mode of experience lead to clear cognition and harmonious responsiveness and not chaos? For the classical Daoist tradition, it's because embodying the way connects you with a deeper source that underlies you in your environment. So from the scientific perspective, while the idea of a way underlying self and world may sound metaphysical, it's entirely possible to explain this as the classical Daoist interpretation of the selfless experience of what we've been calling no person, and the feeling often entailed when that experience happens that one is in sync with a deeper power or force. Also, additionally, there's been some recent scientific research that's actually begun to explore something very similar, if not identical to this. Brian Bruyas's collection of research on effortless attention, much of which emerges from the studies of the flow state first identified by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, investigates psychological phenomena very similar to the attuned subjectivity of classical Daoism. We have a number of books by James Austin, starting with Zen and the Brain. Thankfully, they've gotten shorter with each new publication. So he postulates from putting together a lot of neuroscientific research that we have two attentional networks in the brain, a dorsal and a ventral stream. The dorsal is associated with voluntary focused attention and top-down processing, and the ventral is associated with involuntary reflexive attention and bottom-up processing. The dorsal is associated with egocentric, self-centered processing, always dealing with the question of where is this object in relation to me, and the ventral is associated with allocentric processing. It's other referential, just where is it, utilizes vision and audition a lot. So in terms of this research, we can see classical Taoist practices of apophatic meditation leading first to contemplative states of tranquility and emptiness, and eventually resulting in contemplative traits that involve the transformation of cognition from being subjectively biased and egocentric to being clear and accurate and allocentric. This then creates the condition for effortless attention and action and helps create the conditions for impartial research and creative scholarship. All this comes about through the classical Taoist processes of attuning subjectivity. These are processes that are, of course, not at all limited to this tradition, but are found across many cultures and many cultural traditions. We are just beginning to explore these in our libraries and labs and teach them in the contemplative studies classroom. I'd like to close with a passage from the Zhuangzi that kind of brings some of this together and gives you a more vivid example of flowing cognition or attuned subjectivity in action. The passage goes, "To wear out your wits, fixating on one way of seeing things without realizing that it's no different from any other, we call 3 every morning. A monkey keeper handing out nuts said, 'I'm going to give you 3 every morning and 4 in the evening,' and the monkeys were all in a rage." You can imagine monkeys being in a rage. They jump up and down, they throw things. "All right," very quickly he says, "I'll give you 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening," and the monkeys were all delighted. Without either the name or the reality being at all diminished, the monkey's pleasure and anger were utilized by the keeper. His indeed is a flowing cognition. Therefore, sages harmonize things with their flowing cognition and relax into the center of the potter's wheel of the heavens. Love that metaphor. This is what we call activating both positions. So, in conclusion, apophatic contemplative practices in classical Taoism systematically empty the contents of consciousness, leading to increasingly lengthy states of embodied no-person experience. Incorporating these into first, second, and third-person experience yields increasing freedom from subjective bias and the ability to tap into intuition and creativity. Thank you very much. We have 5 times 2. Yes?
So the contemplative practice at the basic contemplative practice is the breathing practice that you showed us. Is that at the underlying, sort of the entry point?
Yes. So did everybody hear the question? So is the basic Taoist contemplative practice the one that we demonstrated? Is it in essence a breathing practice? That's foundational. From the early tradition, we can pull out a few others. There's one in this inward training text I find very interesting that looks very much like what we would call from India a mantra meditation, repeating the word Tao and understanding kind of in the context of all the different passages about the Tao not being able to be grasped as an object, not being able to be heard or felt or sensed or conceived of. But it looks like in this passage you actually use it and repeat the word Tao. Of course, it wasn't pronounced Tao then, but however it was pronounced. So a mantra-like meditation. They're breathing practices, they're centering practices as well. There's also chapter 5 in the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu talks about a bellows breathing, breathing like a bellows. Heaven and earth is like a bellows. And there's actually reference to this in some of the medical texts that have been discovered in a tomb sealed in 168 BCE at a place called Mawangdui. They actually did something called bellows breathings. It's probably related. And in this, what it looks again to me, trying to reconstruct it, is that you imagine your trunk as a box bellows. The Chinese had a box bellows in which there was a mouth at the top and then there was a handle that you pulled up and down. So in any case, there are a number of instances in the text, quite a few actually, that talk about breathing practice. And then actually, over about a 200-year period of time, we've got texts from the larger Daoist, classical Daoist tradition that talk about preparatory practices that are kind of generally similar, that involve sitting still, relinquishing thoughts, emotions, desires, and then doing a breathing practice, and then going through a successive series of stages. So when your body is aligned in a sitting position, then you become tranquil. And when you become tranquil, then different things happen. You go into these different consecutive states until you eventually have you experience complete emptiness or merging with the Tao, and then you come back into the world and you wu wei or wu bu wei, you take no action, yet nothing is left unattained. With seeing, there's nothing left unseen. With hearing, there's nothing left unheard, and so on. So you have this kind of denouement after this series of stages of meditative concentration. So the Taoists are not only concerned with apophatic meditation, with emptying out, merging with the Tao. They're really actually also equally concerned with taking that back out into the world and how it transforms your consciousness, and how, in terms of the interpretive framework I've been trying to develop, it's in terms of taking the no-person experience and bringing it into first, second, and third-person experience. Thank you. Yes, Alan. Yeah, I would say that the egocentric, allocentric model is a scientific limitation on what I think the Taoists are doing, which is very much what you're talking about. It's really being able to respond within the entire context of the environment spontaneously, taking in, because in essence, from the Taoist perspective, because you have experienced in your own practice, in your own deepest practice, the ground of your own being, you also are, and because that's the ground of being for everything in the environment in which you're interacting, that then becomes the basis for your continuous, harmonious, and spontaneous interaction. So limiting it to egocentric, allocentric, well, it limits it. Yes, Aaron.
How I can't help thinking of what Tom Kasulis calls the without thinking stage of Zen meditation, and rising out of that is a spontaneous responsiveness. And I just wondered if you could tease out the differences for me between the Zen perspective and the Taoist perspective.
That's a great question. I think that Tom Kasulis's without thinking that he talks about, particularly in Dogen, is in many ways similar to what I've been calling a no-person perspective. It's a spontaneous, flowing cognition. I think one of the differences, general differences between the early classical Taoist tradition and the Zen tradition is that we find a kind of more synthetic as opposed to analytic perspective earlier in Daoism, in that even though the Taoists talk about change, and they have their own way of codifying it through the Book of Changes, in a Buddhist and Zen context, there's much more of an emphasis on codependent origination, a specific mechanism for change, and how that links with the emptiness of experience, and the emptiness that's talked about in the Chan, in Buddhist and Chan Zen traditions is different from the emptiness that's talked about in the Daoist tradition. Classical Daoist emptiness is the emptying out the normal contents of consciousness. It's the opposite of somethingness. But emptiness in the Buddhist and Chan traditions is this vast interrelatedness. It's, emptiness of independent existence. So that means it's an affirmation of dependent and codependent arising in existence. Nicole?
Subjectivity when you're working within academic, scientific, medical circles where people often do hold strong views and are not necessarily aware of their bias.
Everybody hear the question? So the question involves, what kind of advice would you give as to how to, within an academic or perhaps an academic, scientific, medical context, how to make people aware of these different values in a context, how to, the value of an attuned subjectivity. And I would say that the scientific research that's being done on it helps to persuade people who are committed to a universe in which scientific truths prevail. And so I think that the best advice is just to blind them with science. Questions at the mic?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my throat's a little weak, so I'll use the microphone. So I really love the example of Butcher Ding and the pragmatism of taking these experiences, this richness of how you live in the world, and having it embodied where the rubber hits the road. And so much of what we're hearing in our conference is about these states of meditation, of sitting, of breathing, and I'm wondering what you see as the challenges or the next steps of bringing this framework into movement, movement-based practices. What happens when people are touching each other or moving, like in Tai Chi or Qigong? What happens even in interactions like improvisational music, where people are present and listening to each other? But it seems like so much of the work is focused on states where people are meditating by themselves, and not so much practical things like how do these practices influence whether you fall down or not, or how good a butcher you are.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Classical Daoism obviously has meditation that is a sitting meditation, sitting still, but there are also moving meditations that look like they're the kind of foundations for what later becomes Qigong and Tai Chi. And I think moving meditation is really interesting and is starting to be explored more in a systematic fashion. My colleague, Dr. Catherine Kerr, has done some research on the kind of the brain locations of different somatic experiences, and she's very interested in looking into the nature of qi and how that relates to different contemplative states. So it's a little harder to hook somebody who's moving up to some sort of way to measure their brain waves. You can't put them in an fMRI and tell them to push hands. But I think it's really important to explore different kinds of moving meditation. The Sufi tradition has wonderful moving meditation that really needs to be more systematically studied. It's kind of, in some ways, it's easier to study people who are doing sitting meditation, and that's why the first studies have been almost exclusively devoted to that. But there are other studies being done now. Thanks. Question?
For better or worse, the name mindfulness has become sort of like the tag for an introduction to the Buddhist tradition, which is a huge thing beyond mindfulness. But at least it's something that's useful, and we all relate to it, and there are hundreds of presentations now. Do you see a tag for the wisdom of this Daoist tradition that's going to be like mindfulness? That's something people can just sort of say a word and it sort of plugs into at least a pathway into this.
I like attunement, actually.
Hmm.
Attunement, because it involves a kind of mindful practice, but it also involves, which is, remembering to come back, whatever you're focusing on. That's important. But also, it's when you do that, you attune yourself to some greater power or force it helps connect you with that. And in so doing, moves you in the direction, at least temporarily, moving in the direction away from a kind of subjective biased perspective to a kind of more neutral, unbiased perspective in which a lot of the blockages to the way that we creatively synthesize ideas or just create new models get removed.
I see. Good. Can I ask one other question?
Sure.
Do you see, I'm wondering, do you have a sense of what it was about the geography or the weather or genetics or something? Why did this, or how did this appear in China? This one place in the world 2,000 years ago, whenever it was. How? Any idea? Was it the weather? Geography? China's hills? Whatever? Any sense? I mean, something did happen there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So there's some similarities between the types of sitting meditation that developed in India and that developed in China, roughly in similar periods of time. And they don't seem to have developed in the same way in other parts of the world, at least at those points in time. So the sinologist Victor Mayer has theorized that yogic practices came into China across the Silk Road, that we have a movement of peoples along the Silk, what later became the Silk Road, much earlier than previously known. And he adduces as proof the fact that we have found these Tokharian mummies at the end of the Silk Road in the Taklamakan Basin, up in the mountains that come out of that. They call them mummies, but they weren't deliberately mummified. And so they're actually radiocarbon dated, some of these to 1000 BCE and even one to, I think, 1900 BCE. And these people have blonde hair. They still have the hair and they have blue eyes. And they're genetically similar to Celts.
Oh my God.
So he hypothesizes that there was this movement from Indo-European culture over into China, and that's the reason for it. I happen to think that even though there is this movement of peoples, that doesn't necessarily mean that contemplative practice of a kind of apophatic type could not develop independently in two places. So until we see that we have a mummy that's found, sitting in full lotus, chanting Om, then I think we're going to have to hold off on affirming that.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. Yes. Right. So I make it very clear to the students from the outset that I'm teaching you a range of contemplative practices to help you understand the text, to give you some insights into yourself, but there's no expectation that you will become Daoist practitioners or Buddhist practitioners. Right now, these Daoist reconstructive meditations are done in the context of I usually use them in the Introduction to Contemplative Studies course. So we'll spend a month on these reconstructed Daoist practices, and then we'll move over to India, and we'll do a month on South Asian normative practices of Vipassana and Shamatha practices, and then we'll come back to China and look at Chan and then go to Japan and do Zen. So students get introduced to maybe 15 or 16 or 18 different contemplative practice over the course of a semester, and there's absolutely no requirement that they do anything more than what they do in the meditation lab. Many of them, however, do, and if they want to pursue outside of the classroom, then on our Contemplative Studies website, contemplativestudies.org, we have a whole series of links to contemplative practice centers from every tradition imaginable. Well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you all for coming this morning, and